I'm Beaver Trapper in Birmingham, and in this segment of the show, I'm hopefully going to share with you lessons that I've learned in the School of Hard Knocks. Hello and welcome to the School of Hard Knocks. Tonight we're going to talk a little more about living through a hyperinflationary environment. In a previous episode, I touched upon my experiences living and working in Bolivia in the middle 1980s when the inflation rate was approximately 20,000% per year. That seemed to generate some interest, and people have asked for a little more information about what it was like down there during that time, and so that's what I'm going to talk about tonight. One of the first things that you'll notice is that the entire banking and finance system is disrupted. It's broken. This is a big change for most people. Americans are used to using credit cards and keeping very little cash on hand. They do most of their transactions by credit card, writing checks, and they really carry very little cash anymore. Cash is almost a nuisance these days. What I found was that when hyperinflation kicks in, people avoid financial institutions. You don't know when the bank is going to close. You don't know when the currency is going to be seized and reissued. You don't know when your assets are going to be confiscated. So what happens is people take their money out of the banks, by and large, and they use cash for transactions, even very large transactions of $20,000, $100,000 or more. When people are buying and selling heavy equipment, when they're doing business for their business rather than their household transactions, they carry large amounts of cash. One of the things that large cash transactions demand is trust. And trust is backed up through ruthlessness. Once the system breaks down, if you rip a man off for $50,000 cash, he's not going to sue you because the court system is non-functional. He's not going to call the police because the police are corrupt. He's simply going to kill you. That's the simple fact of the matter. Contracts in such a time are useless. There's nothing to enforce them. A man's word is everything. Your personal relationships are everything. Your reputation is everything. What you have to have are solid reputations, or solid relationships with people that you're going to do business with. They have to know that you're a man of your word, that if you say you're going to pay them, you will pay them. And if you say that you will deliver something at a certain time, that you will deliver it at a certain time. And I'm not talking about anything illegal, I'm simply talking about doing business. So that's something to sort of chew on, something to think about. If you're the kind of person who doesn't have a good reputation, if you're the kind of person that people don't trust, once the economy breaks down, once the wheels come off, you're going to have a very hard time getting along. Another fascinating thing that I observed was the family compound. One thing I noticed was that if you owned your land, you were okay. If you didn't own your land, you were in trouble. You were poor. Your rent can be raised in a hyperinflationary environment overnight. Your paycheck probably won't increase overnight. You can really get squeezed in that type of environment if you don't own your land where you live. And a walled compound down there was basically a piece of property that had a large wall, a tall wall around it, and it had several distinct living quarters, and it had several common areas that all the living quarters shared. For instance, you would have a main house where the property owner and his wife would live. You would have some concrete block houses, like dormitory style arrangements, where the teenagers could live. You would have another separate concrete block house where the grandparents would live. And what this allowed was for the family to stay together, for all three generations to be living together, but not be under each other's feet and not be infringing on each other's personal space. So Grandpa and Grandma could have their quiet place off to the side. The teenagers could come and go and have their freedom, and the parents could have their nice house. And everybody could live together and stay together without a lot of squabbling. Another thing that was interesting was the shared common areas, namely the kitchen and the bathrooms and showers. You would build a bathhouse that had bathrooms and the shower stalls, and it would be a separate building, and all three living spaces would share that bathroom. This allowed you to save a lot of money on plumbing and water supplies and that sort of thing, which can be difficult when your national infrastructure starts to break down. Because when you're in a hyperinflationary environment, the wheels have come off society. You can't be guaranteed that you're going to have good water pressure. You can't be guaranteed that you're going to have access to the parts needed to maintain 3, 4, 5, 6 bathrooms and showers. And so by having one common area that everybody shared, you eliminated a lot of expense and a lot of headache. Same way with the kitchen. By having a common area out in the middle or off to the side where the cooking was done and where the meals were served, it's just like they had in the old South. You didn't have a lot of heat generated inside the house during the summertime or the hot parts of the year because the cooking was done outside in a separate area. That was really important. Another thing about the family compound idea is that in American life, elderly people are treated as a liability. They're warehoused. They're put off in an old folks' home somewhere. They're considered to be kind of a pain, that they need help. They can't live by themselves when they get to be a certain age. So they're considered to be a liability. In this type of situation, the grandparents were actually an asset because they could help keep the kids. They could keep an eye on the kids. They could help out do some simple chores, keep an eye on things. So they were an asset, not a burden. All the way down to the kids, the little kids before they were old enough to go off to school, they could help open and close the gates of the compound. When a car would pull up, if they knew the car, they would open the gate, the car would pull through, they'd close it. So they'd do chores like that. They had certain things they had to do. And so the kids were an asset. They helped work towards the common goal rather than being this expense that has to be chauffeured around by mom to soccer practice like we do here. Another thing that was interesting was the hired help, the cooks and the gardener or handyman or what have you. They had their own small outbuilding that they lived in, and their children were welcome to stay there just like the family's children were. Now think about all the single moms in this country who are struggling, working a job, trying to pay rent, trying to provide for their children, and they never get to see them. How can they raise them? They never get to see them. They're at work all day. Think about what an arrangement like that, where if a single mother could get a job working for a nice family, living on the premises so they didn't have to pay rent, and they could cook and they could clean, and their children were right there with them all day. As far as the meals were concerned, this was really an eye-opening experience for me. The food was simple. You were eating rice, you were eating soup, you were eating basic meat, salad, breads, that sort of thing. Staples. There were virtually no pre-prepared foods that were bought from the store, like potato chips, or even meals that come in a box, like macaroni and cheese and hamburger helper. None of that. None of the store-bought foods. You couldn't afford any of that. It was too expensive. But what you could afford were the basics. Flour, rice, cornmeal, corn flour, and you would make soup out of any of the animals that you had that you could kill, whether it was rabbits, guinea pigs, what have you. And it was healthy, wholesome soup that had the bones in it, getting the marrow out of the bones. It was homemade soup, not this open a can and pour the salty water into a bowl and eat it. Not that kind of soup. This was good for you soup. As an interesting little story, when I first came home and I got through the customs in Miami International Airport after I'd been gone a long time, I pulled up to a fast food restaurant, the first one I'd visited in a long time. And when I pulled up to the window to get my food, I nearly threw up at the smell of the grease that came out of the window when they opened the window to give me my food. I had been in such a clean environment eating plain food, healthy food, for so long that when I pulled up to the window and I could smell all of the grease from the fried food, it literally gagged me. And what was even more interesting was within 2 weeks of being here, I could no longer even notice it. So when you're thinking about food in a hyperinflationary environment, think staples, think rice, potatoes, think soup. Learn to cook with your preps. Get used to eating your preps. Make them a part of your everyday life. It's going to be healthier. It's going to be cheaper. And when the wheels do come off, you're not going to have a big adjustment to make compared to most people. And as far as meat, you need to broaden your horizons. As a trapper, this has been easy for me, but people don't realize they raise guinea pigs down there for meat like they would rabbits. Now, if you raised rabbits for meat, people could accept that. Here, it would be odd. They'd look at you kind of crazy, but they could accept it. But if you told them you raised guinea pigs and you were going to have rice and guinea pig for supper, you would definitely be out of your mind. But it's good meat, and they're easy to raise. Another fascinating thing was the entire shopping experience during a hyperinflationary period. One thing that was common were open-air markets. Now, what an open-air market does is it avoids the overhead and expense of maintaining a storefront. You don't have to pay rent. You don't have to pay insurance. You don't have to pay for security. You don't have to pay for air conditioning or heating. None of that. You set up shop on the side of the road, and when the sun goes down, you pack your stuff up, you take it with you. A vendor would buy, say, a 55-gallon drum of laundry detergent. This is an interesting example and something to think about. And they would turn around and they would repackage that laundry detergent in little baggies. And they would sell the little baggie for just a few cents. What this did was it virtually eliminated costly packaging. You didn't have to pay for a fancy plastic tub or a bottle. You didn't have to pay for a cardboard box with a fancy logo on it. You weren't paying for the cost of advertising on TV. None of that was built into it. The guy would go out and buy a 55-gallon drum of powdered laundry detergent. He'd put 2 or 3 scoops in a baggie. You could buy it for 5 cents, 10 cents, whatever it was. And what this did is it lowered the cost of the product to the consumer, and it allowed the consumer to only buy what they needed at the time, which is critical when your currency is being devalued on a daily basis. Another thing that I noticed was that there were stores all over the place, little neighborhood mom and pop stores on every corner. Every little nook and cranny was a little store where you could go in and buy things. And at first, to me, this seemed kind of crazy. I would look at this business model and I would say, how can these people make any money when their competition is literally 3 blocks down the road with an identical store selling the identical thing for the identical price? How can anybody make money at this? Well, what the store on every corner allows you to do is it allows you to serve people who can't drive or who don't have cars. If you're walking on foot, you're going to walk to the nearest store, not the one 4 blocks away or 8 blocks away. You're going to walk to the one that's closest to you. And so you could walk down the street, and if you needed to buy 1 cup of sugar and 2 eggs, you could buy 1 cup of sugar and 2 eggs, and then you could walk back home. Whatever you needed, whatever you happen to have the money for, and you didn't have to have a car, you didn't have to pay for a bus or anything like that. So what appears to be an inefficient business model is actually a very efficient distribution model. So in a hyperinflationary environment, when things start to break down, if you have capital and transportation, you can replicate this business model when the time comes. Now the profits might be small, but if you are debt-free, then your cost of living is going to be small. Another interesting facet of the economy was business, conducting business, how businesses would be set up and run in a hyperinflationary environment. One of the first things I noticed was that people would set up shop along the side of the road, sort of in an open-air market. What this allowed them to do was to move. If the flow of commerce moved from one area to another, they could move their business by simply picking up their stuff and walking to the new location. A good example of this was one of my favorite things was people that would sell bread on a stick, the bannock bread as it's called. And basically it's dough that's wrapped around a stick and it's cooked over an open fire. And it's sold to you hot off the coals, and it's good. This type of business had virtually no overhead, no startup cost. It's easy to relocate, and it served a very useful purpose, providing hot, fresh bread to people traveling on roads where there's very little infrastructure. Think about that. When you're traveling down the interstate here in the United States, you can pull off at an exit and you can go to a very nice restaurant and spend a lot of money, or you can pull into a convenience store and buy a bunch of pre-packaged junk food that's not good for you, it's not healthy, it's a bunch of sugar. But you know what? It's virtually impossible to buy hot, fresh bread while you're traveling. You can't pull off the road and get it. So who's really better off? One of the things that I hope you're noticing in everything that I'm talking about tonight is there's a common thread, and that's no government control. You see, government caused these people's ills. They caused the hyperinflation. But when the government collapsed and the people were freed from government regulation, small business prospered and people were able to conduct their affairs perfectly fine without Big Brother looking over their shoulder and telling them what kind of permit they had to have, how far from this food they have to have their bleach, or anything else. People got along just fine. Now, it may sound like everything was wonderful during a hyperinflationary environment, but it's not. There are a lot of downsides and difficulties, and I'm going to touch on a few of those just briefly, just enough to give you something to think about. One of the first things that makes life miserable during a hyperinflationary environment is that anything imported is wildly expensive and it's completely out of the reach of the average person. In Bolivia, that meant any type of car or truck, any type of manufactured tool or anything like that was virtually unobtainable. So you had to keep your old cars running. You had a lot of trouble in that regard. You simply couldn't buy anything new. You couldn't buy any computers. Nothing like that was affordable. You had to be filthy rich to afford anything like that. But anything that was produced locally was generally affordable. They produced their own rice. They grew their own potatoes. They caught their own fish, raised their own meat. So the food was generally affordable. The poor people were not starving. They didn't eat fancy, but they weren't starving. Now think about how much of our food we import. Sure, we're the breadbasket of the world. We grow our wheat, we grow our corn, but look at how much food we're starting to import. Go to Sam's Club, go to Walmart, and just look at what is coming in from China, from Vietnam. Look at the fish that's being farmed in South America and being imported. And think about that. Think about when your currency collapses, what's going to happen to the cost of those goods. Think about our electronics. Our telephones, our computers, all of our electronics is imported. Think about our tools, our hand tools, our machine tools. Most of that's imported. And so what happens is when your currency loses its value, anything that you have to bring in from outside becomes extremely expensive. Think about how much stuff you buy at Walmart. All of that cheap, affordable stuff that you go to Walmart and you get at a really good price. What's going to happen when that cheap Walmart hammer goes up in price 5 times, 10 times? Think about everything that we bring in and what's going to happen. It's going to be very, very, very expensive one day, and the quality is still going to be crappy. So think about that. Think about what you can do to produce here. What foods can you produce here? What foods can you grow here? How can you become more self-sufficient? How can you use your preps in your day-to-day and living experience so that it's not a big change when other sources of supply go down? Think about how you can support people that manufacture things here. How you can support your local community agriculture. So anyway, I hope this has been of value. I hope it's given you something to think about. And until next time, you have a good night.